this room. Give careful thought to this statement. 41 years ago tonight, John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, was murdered. I would like now, and I don't want anyone to feel embarrassed or whatever, I would like now if you would please raise your hands, and if you have a belief that Oswald is the shooter. There are a great many people that believe that, and I would just like to get kind of a consensus as to how many here believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, based on what you've heard and what you read. You weren't down there, so you don't know, but I would just like to get kind of a consensus as to how many here believe that he was the shooter. Can I see a raise of hands? So there's about 40% of the crowd, the audience, that feels that way. Webster's and American Heritage dictionaries say a fact is the thing that has actually happened or is really true. Now remember what I just said to you. A fact is something that really happened and it's true. I'm not going to try to make a presentation to you tonight that is guessing or rambling or going off in left field to try to come up with some ideas. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened and what the facts are, and then I'll let you make your own determination whether I'm giving you that presentation or not. Evidence is something that furnishes proof. So we're going to talk in terms of evidence as the night goes through, and we'll talk in terms of how that affects the Kennedy assassination. The documents are verbal statements or material objects that are admissible as testimony in a court of law. So something that is admissible in a court of law is evidence. And it is something that is present, visible, and conspicuous. All of my talk that I make this evening is based on going back 41 years ago. And so a lot of people say, well, how do you remember all this? And how do you know these things that occurred and where you were on a particular night? So I'm going to tell you a little funny story about the FBI. The FBI, when we went into the Bureau, said that they wanted us to keep a daily report of our activities. And this was a requirement that every agent back in the 60s had to do, 50s, 60s, and even the 70s. And we call it a daily report, and every move that you made, when you went on duty in the morning, if you traveled from a location to a location, whether you went out for a cup of coffee or wherever, you put down that travel time, you put down the location that you went to, how long you were at that location, who you interviewed, what case file you had, and they kept a running tab on all your activities for the entire day. There was two purposes that it served. Number one is if something came up 8 or 10 months later and they needed some information in a court case or whatever it may be, they could refer back to the daily log and they could then pinpoint what you did on that particular day, and that would help refresh your memory. But the other thing that they did is that if they wanted to cause you a little bit of problems on an inspection, all they had to do was to bring out the daily report and say, well, what were you doing on June 14th at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? And that's an impossibility for anyone to recall those particular times. So they said, under no circumstances are you to make a copy of the daily report. But they didn't say anything about making that same information available by other means. So every agent in the FBI kept what they call a diary. And what we did was we wrote into that diary everything that happened on a particular case, the file numbers and so on, so that if they did come through with an inspection that we would have the answers to try to give them some response to their questions in that without having them to know that we were doing this. But I think everybody in the Bureau knew that we were doing it. So everything is refreshed in memory by that means. So I'm going to tell you a story now. I'm going to tell it to you just like it happened. And then we'll go from there, and we're going to have an intermission at about halfway through the story, and then we'll come back and we'll go on with the rest of the talk, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. So I'll try to make this as brief as possible, but I know that sometimes these get extended out. My first assignment was to the Atlanta office of the FBI, and shortly after I was in the office there, I was transferred to a little town called Thomasville, Georgia. And when I arrived in Thomasville, Georgia, there was one agent working down there who had been singular. It was only a one-man RA for many, many years, all the time before I went down there. I was the first agent that went in there that made it a two-man RA, two-man resident agency. And a resident agency is a part of a field office, and the field office is Atlanta and Albany and Thomasville and all the towns, Decatur, and all the places in Georgia and that are then resident agencies out of the field office. So I arrived in Thomasville and I worked down there for a period of time. And on November the 13th, 1963, I worked that entire day, and I went home to my residence about 5:30 in the evening for dinner. And while we were seated at dinner, the phone rang, and it was the agent in charge from the Atlanta FBI office. And he told me that he had a matter that he wanted me to investigate the very first thing the next morning, that it was a priority, and that it involved the assassination, a discussion on the assassination of the President Kennedy. Now remember, I said this is November the 13th. Today is the 41st anniversary, which is 41 years ago. But this is on November the 13th, some number of days before November 22. And so he tells me that they have an informant, and that this informant had told them that they had two ways that they were plotting to kill the president. And one was going to be that when he flew to Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, that he would move by motorcade from there with an open limousine and travel up Collins Avenue to the Palm Beach residence of his mother and father, the Kennedy compound. If that's the case, and that's what they knew to be the fact, they were going to secrete a sniper who was involved with these informants, and they were going to put this sniper up into a palm tree and then kill the president in the motorcade with the sniper, knowing that he would be shot by the Secret Service once he did this, but he was willing and dedicated to this strong bitterness that they had towards the president, and said that they were going to go ahead and do it that way. The second thing is if that failed, then what they had planned on doing was to rent an apartment or a office building up in Lafayette, across from Lafayette Park in Washington, and then shoot him with a high-powered rifle off of a tripod. And those were the two plans that they had, and those were the two things that they told me that the informant told them that this subject that I was going to be working on the next morning was involved in. I immediately contacted the chief of police in Whitman, Georgia, who was a good friend of mine, which is where this subject lived, and told Bill that I needed his help on this, and that anything he could do to give me assistance I would appreciate. And he said, I'll give whatever you need, Don. If you need my life, I'll give you my life for this. I'll help you any way I can. And so as a result of it, I joined Bill the next morning, and we started a full investigation on Joseph A. And I've always referred to this man as Joseph A. Because at that time, Oswald or any of these things were not known, and so there was no reason for me to have to discuss this subject with anybody. So I talk in terms of that, and I'll talk tonight about Joseph A. Did a full background investigation on him, did photograph surveillance on him, tried to get photographs of him. Went to his high school, went to his military records, went to the police departments, and did an extensive investigation and worked on it all the way from the day that we got the assignment until Saturday or Friday, and then Saturday I hand carried all this material up to Atlanta to the agent in charge, who told me that he was going to give it to the Secret Service agent in charge, and they were going to go ahead and use it for their purposes based on what the informant had told them. So my investigation was completed. I felt comfortable with it. I felt that I knew everything that I needed to know about Joseph A. or as best as we could determine. Found a fingerprint card for him in the Lowndes County Jail in the basement. And with that fingerprint, that made a positive identification of this guy. So we felt very good about that. Once that happened, as far as our investigation was concerned, and we turned all the material over to the Secret Service, we were through with it. And that was, as I said, on the 13th of November. You can imagine how I felt on November the 22nd just a few days later, when they found out in the afternoon, what happened is we have a common band radio on all law enforcement agencies at that time. And so anything that is secret or something that doesn't need to go to the public and that, they have a code 36 and they ask you to dispatch to the Thomasville Highway Patrol Barracks, at which time they'll give you the information of what they need to give it to you privately. And we got a code 36, and Royal McGraw, my partner, was in the car with me, and we immediately proceeded to the Thomasville Barracks. And when we got there, the sergeant behind the desk, who knew us very well, said, "I want to see your credentials," and that. And I showed him my credentials, and I was kind of startled at that. And he said, "You're immediately to go to the Department of Agriculture. There's a message there for you." And so Royal and I took off, and we drove from there to the federal building, which is a new federal building, and we went to the Department of Agriculture. Now, Department of Agriculture has capabilities for teletype because they're nationwide. The FBI being relatively a new agency in that, in comparison to Department of Agriculture, we did not have teletype capabilities. So when I walked into the agriculture office and that, the lady asked again for identification, and then she said, "Would you follow me, Mr. Adams?" And I walked back with Royal, and we went back to their office, teletype office. And the teletype read, "The president is dead. Call your Atlanta office immediately." And now you can imagine how I felt and what went through my mind. It just devastated me, because I thought that somehow, and unconsciously I think everyone would think that way, that you messed up, you made a mistake. It's so close to Joseph Fay's investigation, and now we've got an assassination. And I was devastated. Well, I immediately left there. We went down to the FBI office in the same building, called the Atlanta office, and the agent in charge said to me, "I want you to immediately go out and find Joseph Fay and hold him for the Secret Service. The president has been shot in Dallas, and I can't discuss anything further with you than that. The Secret Service wants Joseph Fay located and held for them as quickly as possible." Now, remember that I had done a very extensive investigation with Bill Elliott, the chief. Bill and I spent a great deal of time going to all of his haunts and knew everything we could possibly muster up about this guy. And we went back and repeated. I went back and I met with Bill Elliott. I left Royal McGraw, and I went back and I worked with Bill, and we went to every place, and we got a hold of the sheriff in Lowndes County, and we got a hold of the sheriff in Quitman, and asked them to assist us on it. And we had 4 of us that were out looking for him and could not find him, or his VW bus. Excuse me. The VW bus is very distinctive because it has placards all over the sides of it supporting Strom Thurmond and all types of right-wing propaganda, and they were very, very strong in their convictions and about how they hated the Kennedys and so on. So anyway, as a result of that, we did Chief Elliott and I did a massive investigation and could not find Joseph Fay in Quitman or Valdosta. He lived with a prostitute over in Valdosta, common law, for years, by the name of C.C. Cofield. She did not know who we were, but in our work up in that, we learned about her, and we did photo surveillance on her place, and we checked her place and known places that he went to in Valdosta, and we did not find him. I just want to show you, this is a newspaper that is from the Atlanta Journal, showing the killing of President Kennedy. And then this is the Thomasville Times where I worked at, President John Kennedy assassinated in Dallas. So as a result of that, then we did our work and went through everything to try to find him, and we did not locate him. Notified the agent in charge in Atlanta and told him that Joseph Fay is not anywhere to be found. He may be visiting with relatives or someplace or out of state or something, but he's definitely not in Quitman or in Valdosta based on all we've done. To show you how extensive I did that investigation, before I did my day's work in the morning, and at lunch when I was taking my lunch break, and in the evening before I finished my day's work, I drove from Thomasville, Georgia, or whatever county I was working in, and I went to his home in Quitman, Georgia, and I went to Coalfield's residence in Valdosta and spot checked both of those places 3 times a day. If it was 11 o'clock at night, I did it at 11 o'clock at night. And I did due diligence on this every single day to try to locate him. And we didn't find him. On November the 27th, we were doing a workup on him, and I spotted his vehicle. And I want to just hit a couple of points to make you aware of the fact that when you're doing an investigation like that and you come across an individual of his stature based on what was told to us by the Secret Service, that we didn't want to take any risk in that of something happening. And so I was by myself when I spotted his vehicle at Coalfield's residence. So I backed away from there and I went into town and I picked up the phone and I called the agent in Valdosta who knew nothing about this case. And I called Ken Williams and I said, Kenny, I need your help. There's a subject over here and we need to get him in custody or get him held for the Secret Service, and that will you please come and join me. So by the time I made my phone call, because again I couldn't go on the radio, and by the time we got back to Coalfield's residence, he was gone. His VW bus was gone. So I went in and I talked to Coalfield. I said, Kenny, we have no choice. I'm the case agent. I got to make that determination. We're going to go talk to her. So we went in and we talked to her and told her we had to find Joseph A. Where is he at? And she said he left about 15 minutes ago. He's got his Volkswagen bus completely loaded with all kinds of materials and his bag and everything, bags and stuff. And he's leaving and he's going north to Atlanta. And then from there, I don't know where he's going. So Kenny and I took off, and we took off at high rates of speed, and you can imagine, I mean, how important it was to locate him. And we drove 54 miles before we located him on the Atlanta highway, going north to Atlanta. Stopped his vehicle, pulled him out of the vehicle, shook him down, checked his vehicle over for weapons, took him in, put him in my car, in the back of my car. Since I was a case agent, it was my responsibility. And then we called the Thomasville Highway Patrol and asked them to have a hook come up, a tow company come up and tow the vehicle back to Thomasville for us and put it into impound, which we did do. As I said, it was just amazing. We took him back to the resident agency. And on the way back, let me jump back, I want to tell you a little funny story about him. Before we got out of the car and that, he said to me, I haven't had a bite to eat, and I have my food here, and there was a banana in a bag sitting there, and he said, I would like to take that along, could I have a bite to eat? To show you the carelessness as a new agent in that I never gave it a thought, and I said, sure, by all means, go ahead and take your meal. And he grabbed a bag, and we put him in the car, and then took him back to the resident agency. He set the bag on the desk, and I sat directly across from him, and Kenny sat over to the left of the desk and he sat on the other side of the desk. And I want to tell you this, the FBI dictated to me the questions that they wanted me to ask him. They specifically had certain questions that they wanted me to ask him, and I made a comment, and I can remember making a comment to the agent in charge, and I said, well, you know, we can find out a great deal about this guy, where he traveled at, who he met with, where he stayed at. I mean, there's a lot of intelligence that we can get through him, and I'd like to really probe into him. And he said specifically, you'll ask the questions that I have given you and nothing else. And then when you finish those questions and that, then you're to call and let us know that the Secret Service is on the way or whatever. And I said, fine. So I abided by those rules. And during the course of the interview, we were only in the interview for just a few minutes. And then he said to me, you're tape recording my conversation. And it shocked me. I mean, he walked in with us. He didn't see me walk over and press any buttons or do a darn thing like that. And it shocked me that he said that. And I said, why did you say that, Joe? And he said, I know you guys, how you operate. And I know that you're tape recording my conversation. I said, well, you're crazy as hell. I'm not tape recording your conversation. But that bothered me that he said that, and so I immediately got up from the table and I walked around to the desk, and I walked around the desk and went over to that bag, and I lifted up that banana. And underneath the banana, he had a tape recorder with the reels running, and he was tape recording my entire conversation. To show you the cleverness of this guy and how radical he was, that he wanted to get this information from us on what we were doing in there. Could have had a weapon in there, could have had a gun in there, could have shot Ken and I. I mean, foolishness on our part, but I learned a lesson. Never trust him after that. And I never made that mistake again for the rest of my career. So we held him, and it's 41 years ago. I believe that they ended up, based on the answers that he gave us and gave us a negative response on everything, that the Secret Service came through and said that they will contact him now that they know where he's at, and that they will talk with him. Now remember, I located him on November the 27th. So from November 22nd to November the 27th, for that many days, I went over morning, noon, and night and looked for him, as the chief did and the two sheriffs, and we never found him. And we could not locate Joseph A. Okay, so that was the end of him. I did my work up on him. We did everything we did. I lived on the television that weekend, watched everything that there was to be said about the assassination, as you can well imagine if you were sitting there watching it firsthand. Went through all the things with Oswald, and then saw the movement of Oswald on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, and they shot him and they killed him. Jack Ruby shot him and killed him. And so that really impacted me. But I have to say truthfully to you that I was relieved, because of the factor that it wasn't my subject. It wasn't the guy that I worked on. It wasn't Joseph A., so I didn't fail. And it's a terrible thing to say, but I put yourself in my position. I think everyone has that natural reaction that you feel that way. Okay? Excuse me. And so anyway, I'll try not to spill that when I reach down and get it. Anyway, as a result of that, in June of the following year, I get a transfer, and where do I get transferred to but Dallas, Texas? And when I get to Dallas, Texas, as soon as I arrived there, the agent in charge, J. Gordon Shanklin, called me into his office and said, "You're going to be working the Kennedy assassination. We have still 200 and some agents here. We had 380 here, and now we're down to 200 and some, but we're still working a lot of leads on the Kennedy assassination, so I want you to do two things. Number one, I want you to go into the Kennedy room, and I want you to see the Zapruder film, the actual pictures that were taken by Zapruder, Abraham Zapruder, of the killing of Kennedy. And then secondly, I want you to go to the book depository, and I want you to go to the loft, and I want you to look out the window and familiarize yourself with it, and then also the building itself, so you know the whereabouts of everything in that building, because you're going to be probably having to deal with some leads that may come as a result of that." And so the next day or the day after, I went with a couple of senior agents. I went with a couple of senior agents, first of all, to the Kennedy room. And the Kennedy room was a very large room. And they had 5-drawer file cabinets completely circling everything except the door openings and the windows. And every single drawer in that room was completely filled with information that came in from all over the world concerning the killing of President Kennedy. It was unbelievable, because I searched some stuff that I had done in Thomasville, Georgia, and tried to find it in that mass of paperwork, and I could not find my own material. Sat down and watched the Zapruder film, and as a result of watching that, when the headshot hit Kennedy, I made a comment and said to the effect that that shot didn't come from the back, that shot came from the front. And one of the two agents that were seated with me in that said, "Don, hold your comments to yourself. The Warren Commission is in, they're doing their work up on this thing, and they've already said Lee Harvey Oswald is a single shooter, and that all the shots came from the back, from the book depository." And that kind of bothered me, that I was cautioned by that. I said, okay. And so I wanted to ask more questions, but that's a very touchy subject, and as a result of it, I didn't ask them anymore. And we left there, and then the next day, or maybe even that same day, I went to the book depository and went to the loft and looked out the window. And Doug, and that's the picture that you see when you look out the window of the loft looking down on Elm Street. And the direction of those cars is the same direction that the president's limousine was taking when he was shot. And when I saw that tree that you see there now was in a heavier foliage, and I asked the two agents that were with me, I said, what was said about the time frame as far as his shooting was concerned? And they said that he fired 3 shots in 7.5 seconds with a scope rifle. And I said, what was the tree condition back in November 22nd as it is shown as I'm looking out the window in June now? And they said it's the same thing at that time of the year, it's still in full foliage. And I made another observation and I said, there's no way in the world that he could have shot 3 rounds in 7.5 seconds and did the shooting as accurate as he did. These are 2 different agents that were with me than the ones that were with me in the Kennedy room. And again, I was cautioned, basically on the same theme, don't say anything about it. Warren Commission's in, keep your observations to yourself. And I did, and I paid no more attention to it. I did a lot of work in Dallas. Go ahead and show the next frame. This is a reenactment of the shooting of Kennedy with a scope. And Joe Abernathy and Bill, I can't think of his first name, were in the car, and they were reenacting this as to what it looked like from the scope going from Oswald's rifle down into the automobile. I worked there for a while, and then I got transferred from, I worked a number of cases. I mean, we got a lot of leads in. I saw a rifle looking out of a window. I had to go all the way back to NBC or CBS News in New York and trace all that out, and it turned out to be not correct in that. So we had a lot of leads that were covered as they told me that we would do. I subsequently was then transferred from Dallas, Texas to Lubbock, Texas. I spent 3.5 years in Lubbock, Texas with my family. I subsequently came back to Dallas, Texas, and then stayed there for a year, from there to Buffalo, and then I worked in Buffalo for 3 years, and then from Buffalo to Akron, and I retired here after 11 years in Akron. In 1975, while I was riding in my bureau car here in Akron, Ohio, I heard a radio cast about the fact that there was a letter that went to the Dallas FBI office from Oswald to the agent who was in charge of Marina Oswald and him, a man by the name of James Holsty. And that letter that had been given to the FBI was reportedly destroyed by the FBI. And so that perked my ears up real quick, because I was involved in an accident and some documents were destroyed by the agent in charge because they had given me an improperly repaired government car. And so I felt this as support documents to help me, and so as a result of it, I really paid much attention to this, and I immediately then filed a Freedom of Information request with the FBI in Washington to get any information concerning destruction of any documents by the agent in charge in the Dallas FBI office. And so I received in the mail with my name on it, an envelope which was hand carried from Washington to Cleveland, and then I was called to Cleveland and I went up and picked it up. And in that envelope was this memorandum here, going from the FBI director to the Attorney General. And it generally talks in terms of just general statements concerning the FBI's role as far as the investigation is concerned. The next page is what you want to pay attention to, on page 21 at the bottom, and it reads, according to Holsty, nothing further occurred concerning this memorandum and the Oswald note until Sunday, November 24th, 1963. He said he was on duty in the office on that date, handling various duties, when he learned that Oswald had been shot and later learned that he had died. Approximately 2 hours later, he received word from Mr. Howe that Mr. Shanklin wanted to talk to the both of them, and they proceeded to Mr. Shanklin's office. On entering, Mr. Shanklin stated, "Oswald is dead now. There will be no trial." He then handed Holsty his memorandum of November 22, 63, with a note from Oswald attached, and told him to get rid of it. He claims the memorandum had not been block stamped or serialized, which every single document that comes in the FBI is serialized or block stamped. Told him to get rid of it. He tore up both copies of the memorandum and the note in the presence of Shanklin and Howe and threw them in the waste paper basket in Mr. Shanklin's office. He advised that Mr. Shanklin then said, "Get rid of it. Get it out of here." He said he then took the torn pieces out of the waste paper basket, left Mr. Shanklin's office, went to the men's washroom, and flushed the scraps of paper down the commode. He said that no one was with him when he did this. I was astounded when I heard this. And then when I read this, it was unbelievable that you would take something from an individual as important as Oswald was in this investigation and then take a document and destroy it. Shanklin said that under no circumstances would he order the destruction of that document, and as far as he was concerned, that he would never order it. Yet here is a communication that's gone from the director of the FBI to the Attorney General saying that's exactly what he did do. They destroyed that document. No one knows what was in that document, but Nanny Fenner, who was a clerk in the Dallas office who I worked with and who was a very nice lady in that, she said that there was a threat in that letter to Oswald. Whether it was a threat to kill Holsty or whether it was a threat to blow up the FBI office, she couldn't remember, but she knew that there was some type of threat in that note. And the importance of that is, and why you'll understand now the significance of it, is that if that information is correct, and he had this note for 2 weeks or a week and a half before November 22nd, which he left in his work box and left it sit there till the 22nd of November, if there is a threat in there to do some bodily harm to somebody, that person then is automatically put into what we call our index. And our obligation is immediately to notify the local authorities and the Secret Service that there's a potential person who might do harm to the president. So if that letter had that in there, and there was a threat in there to do harm to the president, the Secret Service never got wind of it. And my question is, why would you destroy a note that has no significance? Okay, let's now leave Dallas, Texas, Lubbock and everything, and I'm out of the FBI, I'm retired now. And in December of 1992, I'm invited to go to a Christmas party at very good friends of ours, very close personal friends of ours by the name of Dannemillers, Tom and Evelyn Dannemiller. And Evelyn just passed away recently. And their son, Larry, is here from Houston, Texas tonight, who really started me in this investigation. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But we're at this Christmas party and at his house, and Larry comes over and says to me, "Will you tell me about what happened concerning your investigation on Kennedy, on the Kennedy assassination? I understand that you had some involvement in it before you came up here and while you were with the FBI. Would you be kind enough to tell me the story?" And I had no reason why not to tell him that. I was now working for the Brennan Group, and so I told him the story about Joseph A. And I didn't tell him the last name because there was no reason for him to know that last name. Because as far as the public was concerned, Oswald was the shooter. Maybe somebody else helped him, but my guy had nothing to do with it. And so I told him the whole story. And while the evening was going on, the people who were there, a number of them came over to the table and sat and listened to the talk. And when we finished the talk, Larry said to me, "I'm reading a good book in Houston." He said, I'm a Kennedy buff. He said, I read everything I can get my hands on as far as the Kennedy assassination. And I'm going back to Houston, and I'm reading this book now. And when I finish this book, I'll send it to you. And I said, wow, okay, fine, Larry, I appreciate that. So some weeks went by, and all of a sudden my secretary came over and she said, Mr. Adams, there's a cardboard box that came in for you, it's on your desk. And so I went over and opened up the desk, the box on the desk, and in that box was this book called High Treason. Okay? And in this book is a note, and it says, Joseph A. is mentioned in the back section, good reading, Larry, as you see up there. And this is from Larry Dannemiller, who's sitting right here. And I thought, now wait a minute, how many Joseph A's are there in this country? And the guy that I talked about, he's not going to be talking about the same person. And so anyway, as a result of it, I immediately went to the index because that would be the first thing that I would do. And then looking in the index, I found Joseph Adams Milteer, which now for the first time you've heard his name. And it's the first time I've told it to you. And Joseph Adams Milteer is mentioned in the index, and it shocks me that I saw the name there. Because up until that particular time, I didn't think that anybody knew other than Bill Elliott and the sheriffs and a few other people knew about Joseph Adams Milteer. And then I went immediately to the appendix. And I want to read this to you. It's not real clear up there, but I want to read this to you because I want to make a point. It said, the strongest documented evidence of a right-wing plot against the president is the case of Joseph Adams Milteer, an ultra-right-wing fanatic described by one FBI informant as one of the most violent men in the country. Milteer was a ranking member of several hate groups, including the National States Rights Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the American Constitution Party, and the White Citizens Council of Atlanta. On the morning of November the 9th, now think about what I'm telling you now, on November the 9th, 1963, some 2 weeks before the assassination of President Kennedy, William August Somerset, an informer for the FBI and the Miami police, known as Informant 88, tape recorded in his own apartment a threat against President Kennedy made by his boyhood friend Joseph Milteer. Somerset, well, how in the hell do you figure would be the best way to get him? Milteer, from an office building with a high-powered rifle. Somerset, do you think he know he is a marked man? Milteer, sure he does. Somerset, they are really going to try to kill him? Milteer, oh yeah, it's in the works. Brown, Jack Brown of the Ku Klux Klan Imperial Wizard himself, Brown is just as likely to get him as anybody in the world. Somerset, you think, Somerset, hitting this Kennedy is going to be a hard proposition. I tell you, I believe you may have figured out a way to get him, the office building and all that. I don't know how the Secret Service agents cover all them office buildings everywhere he is going. Do you know whether they do that or not? Milteer, well, if they have any suspicion, they do that, of course. But without suspicion, chances are they wouldn't. Somerset asks Milteer for more details of the impending assassination. Milteer, you would disassemble a gun. You don't have to take a gun up there in one piece. You can take it up in pieces. All those guns come knocked down. You can take them apart. The conversation drifts to other matters, returning later to the subject of the assassination. And on and on and on it goes. Milteer is talking, and this total conversation is being tape recorded with a tape recorder that was planted by the Miami Police Department and the FBI in Miami. And they record every single word that he said. Okay? And he talks in terms of the two important things out of that whole thing is take him out of a tall building with a high-powered rifle. On November the 9th, this is. On November, I'm not going to be able to give you the exact dates in that, but on November, there's a lot more as far as this memorandum is concerned. Go ahead and show the next 2 pages. He said, Somerset asked Milteer if he had been guessing about the assassination. Milteer replied, I don't do any guessing. And then the 2 men traveled to North Carolina. On their way up, Milteer said, well, I told you so. It happened like I told you, didn't it? That's the way it was supposed to have been done, and that's the way it was done. So Milteer is now bragging to Somerset on the way to North Carolina that he had, that Kennedy was killed the way he said it was going to happen and that. So anyway, as a result of that, and then read and go back 2, please. One more, 409. Right there. That second paragraph. During the interview with the FBI, Milteer emphatically denied ever making threats to assassinate President Kennedy or participating in any such assassination. Even though the FBI had in their possession the Somerset Milteer tape recording, they took Milteer's word for it and ignored their own evidence. And I'll talk about that in a little bit about the November 9th tape recording. They're saying that we knew about it when we interviewed Milteer. So anyway, as a result of that, I was just devastated when I saw that appendix. And then I went to the photograph section of the book, and there up on the left-hand corner is Joseph Adams Milteer as he looked in a photograph that was taken a long time ago. And next to him is William August Somerset, the informant, who had been providing all this information to the FBI and the Miami Police Department. And then when I was devastated more than anything was when I looked at the next photograph and saw Milteer standing looking at the president's car just a few moments before the president was killed. And now you know how I felt. And this is the man that I had done all this work on. And I mean, I just couldn't get over what happened there when I read that. And I'm an emotional person in that, and it troubled me deeply that this happened. And yet I know in my heart that I did everything that I possibly could have done to make that investigation as thorough and as proper as I possibly could have done. I do all my investigations that way, I do all my work that way, and I put my heart into it, and I know that I did the best I could. Something happened, but I can't tell you what happened at that time, okay? So when I see this photograph and I see what happened here, it changed my life. It started making me realize how small this world is, and that here I sat across the desk from this guy, and that he talked about killing the president in a tape-recorded conversation 2 weeks before the occurrence of the killing of the president, and I knew nothing about that tape-recorded conversation. And that deeply troubled me. Why, as a case agent of Joseph Adams Milteer, who lived in Quitman, Georgia, did I not have all the information concerning a tape-recorded conversation that occurred 2 weeks before the assassination? And that bothered me. And then I went on, and the next page will show you a teletype that was sent to all the agents in charge, special agents in charge over the entire FBI, all the FBI. Threat to assassinate President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, November 22-23, 1963. Info has been received by the Bureau determined that a militant revolutionary group may attempt to assassinate President Kennedy on his proposed trip to Dallas, November 22-23, 1963. Check informants, do all the work that we had to do. And I found this through a friend of mine in a file. Was given to me that this was in existence, and I knew nothing about that. So you can imagine how impacting this is when you know that you have this occurrence, and there was nothing that you could do, in your personal opinion, to have changed or altered that. And yet, when you go back and you review the actions after November the 9th of 63, the Secret Service altered the travel plans for President Kennedy when he was going to Miami a week before that, before November 22nd, or the week of November 22nd, the week before that. And he was traveling via motorcade, and he was going to make a speech in Miami, Florida. And they altered his travel plans and put him on a helicopter and flew him into the site where the speech was made, and then flew him back out of there. So they took the precaution to make sure that he did not get hurt, and they had, and I read some reports on it. I have reports here from the Secret Service where they really took every precaution that they possibly could to make sure that nothing happened to the president on that trip. One of the things that I was looking at just recently, it says in here, on November the 18th, 1963, Special Agent Robert Jamison of the Miami Secret Service office, in an interview with Somerset, had him place a telephone call to Milteer at his home in Valdosta, Georgia, to verify that he was in that city. And then it goes on and asks other information in that. But the point is that the Secret Service knew about it, the FBI knew about it, the FBI knew about the November the November 9th interview. And here I'm the case agent working this subject in Quitman, Georgia, and I knew nothing about this. And I interviewed this man, and I never even got a chance to ask that question about the tape recording or anything. And you know as well as I know, if you know Don Adams, the President of the United States would have never gone to Dallas had I had the information on what was said on November the 9th about a tall building and a high-powered rifle and a backup system that I investigated, a separate investigation concerning Homestead Air Force Base and also the office building in Washington, D.C. So it just shocked me that I knew nothing about this, and I'm still troubled to this day by this. It still bothers me tremendously to this day why there was subterfuge or why there was avoidance or whatever you want to call it to give me the information that I could do my job properly. But I want to tell you a little funny story about the kind of people that you deal with in this, and you don't realize the makeup and the structure of what they're about. When I was, shortly after I arrived in Thomasville, Georgia, and assigned to work with Royal McGraw, and he was a senior agent of probably 11 or 12 years more time service than I did. Royal took me out to meet all the sheriffs and to meet all the chiefs of police as a new agent who had never been there. And as I said, I was the first person that ever made that office a two-man office. And we went out to see A.E. White in Donaldsonville, Georgia. And while we were there in his office, which was an old-fashioned county building, I had to use the restroom, and I said to the sheriff, I'm going to excuse myself, and he said, well, just go ahead and use my restroom, it's right there. And so I went in and I used the restroom, and I left the door ajar because it was just the sheriff and Agent McGraw and myself in the room there, and I wasn't worried about it, so I left the door ajar. And I heard this statement made by my fellow agent. He said, you've got to watch out for him because he's a Catholic, he's a Yankee, and he's a Republican. And this is the agent that I'm working with. And that just shocked me. But that was Royal McGraw. Royal McGraw was born in Americus, Georgia. He's a Georgia-growing boy, spent all of his life in Georgia, and he was the closest personal friend of all these people. And yet, I knew nothing of his involvement or anything that he ever had to do with investigating Joseph Milteer. Now I want to show you, I want to go to the next slide, and I want to show you some of the things that occurred in Dallas, Texas that I think you need to know about. There were 18 people who were in Parkland Hospital who were on the nursing staff, doctor staff, or orderlies or whatever. And they were interviewed at the time of the assassination and asked where the president was shot at. And every one of them said that the back of his head by the cerebrum was blowed out and that the whole right side of his head was gone. That's a sketch by the doctor showing basically what I was just telling you, and the hand indications by the lady and the man there indicate that it was the back of his head that was blowed out. Okay? Now let's talk about the shots that are fired. Let's go to shot number one. The first shot fired and missed the car, but both the president and Connally reacted to it. Connally turned around to the right to look at the president, John Kennedy, stopped waving, turned his head 90 degrees to the right, looked directly toward the grassy knoll, and lowered his hand. That's shot number one. Okay, shot number two. The next shot came from the front and struck the president in the throat, causing him to quickly grab his throat. His wife turned to look at him. And if you look at the Zapruder film, you'll notice that the president raises his arms and puts his hands in front of his throat. And you will see that. It's very evident in the Zapruder film. Okay, that's a shot from the front. Okay, they did a tracheotomy on the president, and this is his full face on the gurney in Dallas at Parkland Hospital. They did a trach on him, but But when the doctors did the trach, they observed and noted that there was a hole in his throat, a bullet hole, an entrance wound in his throat first. And then they did the trach on him to try to survive him and revive him and keep him alive. Okay. Shot number 3. Governor Connally heard the first shot, but he apparently did not hear the second shot, which was fired approximately 2 seconds later. He looked back to his right to check on the president. He started to turn to his left, and he was battered by a high-powered bullet. This shot narrowly missed John Kennedy, struck the governor in the back, coursed through his chest, and exited by his right nipple. I have newspaper articles here that are dated November 28, 1963, on an interview of Governor Connally. And he says, the bullet fragmented, it broke 3 ribs, cut a lung, shattered the right wrist, and made a slight wound above the left knee. He says, when the first shot hit the president, I turned to the left. The president had slumped. He said, oh, then I was hit. I knew I was hit bad. Mrs. Kennedy said, oh my God, they've killed my husband, Jack. Connally said his wife, who was sitting next to him on the jump seat facing the Kennedys, said, my God, they're going to kill us all. Connally said that after he was shot, the president was shot again. This means the president was hit first, and then Connally afterwards, and then back to the president again. Shot number 4 struck the president in the back, 6 inches below the shoulder line to the right of the spinal column. He still sat erect, held up by his back brace. The 4th shot, the 3rd bullet to actually strike a human target, is supposed to have traveled through the president's body, exited his throat, entered Connally's back by his right armpit, and exited his chest by the right nipple, and then struck him in the left and the right wrist and embedded itself in his left thigh. Now, if you look at this, the way it was sketched out, the bullet hit the president, then made a turn in the air, and then entered into the Connally from the back, and then did the damage that he just described, that was just described. Okay? Next photograph shows, for the first time in the trajectory of bullets that was done as far as the investigation was concerned, that a shot came from number 4 from the grassy knoll. And this was done, I think, in I'm not sure the date on this thing, but it was some time later when they finally realized that there was a shot that came from the grassy knoll. Okay, let's go to shot number 5. The fatal 5th shot struck the president in the head, and the power of the frontal impact threw his body rearward and to the left. The motorcycle officers flanking the president's car knew instantly that he had been badly injured. Officer Bobby Hargis, riding on Mrs. Kennedy's side of the motorcade, was struck in the face by a sheet of blood and brain tissue from the president's shattered head. I want to re-emphasize that again. I want you to read on the next slide. I want to read to you. It says, the main thrust of the impact debris was toward the 2 motorcyclists riding in a convoy behind and to the left of the presidential limousine. Officer B.J. Martin, riding the outboard cycle some 5 feet to the left and 6 to 8 feet to the rear of the presidential car, later noticed bloodstains on the side of my helmet, other material that looked like pieces of flesh. Officer Martin's partner riding the inboard cycle was even more splattered. It seemed like his head exploded, testified Officer Bobby Hargis. And I was splattered with blood and brain and a kind of bloody water. The splash of the debris so established in his mind the idea that the shot came from the right front that he got off the cycle and led the chase into the knoll, to the grassy knoll. Shot number 6. 6/10 of a second after the fatal headshot, a 6th bullet shattered a large bone in Governor Connally's wrist and embedded itself in the left thigh just above the knee. Mrs. Kennedy, who had climbed up from her seat, was trying to retrieve a skull fragment of her husband's head that had landed on the rear of the car. And if you look at the Zapruder film, you will see Mrs. Kennedy jump out of the car, climb on the back of the trunk, and she literally picked up a part of his brain and skull and put it in her hand and brought it back into the seat. Agent Clint Hill ran up and jumped on the car thinking that she was trying to get out of the car. And he stayed on the back of the car, and she held this in her hand through a great deal of time in Parkland Hospital, at which time it was finally taken away from her by some doctor. And she held on to that because that was her husband. Additional shots. There were at least 2 other shots fired in Dealey Plaza that day, perhaps even 4 more. 3 bullet marks were found in various places in the plaza, one by the south curb of Elm Street, one on the north sidewalk of Elm Street, and one by the south curb of Main Street. The latter mark was caused by a bullet that hit the curb and splintered. A fragment of metal and some concrete struck bystander James Teague on the cheek while he was standing near the triple underpass. And the next slide will show you, this is Mr. Teague standing down here. That's the curb. The FBI actually pulled the curb out. It took them like 8 months after the assassination, and a lot of discussion about this, and then finally the FBI went in and removed that curb and sent it away to the FBI laboratory, and they proved back that there were lead fragments that matched the same context of the lead that was out of the Oswald's weapon. Okay. And then this manhole cover, there were 2 women that were standing there, and a shot or 2 thumped into the ground next to them, and they had a Dallas deputy sheriff and a FBI agent who went over to this woman, who brought it to their attention that this had occurred. And they went over and they dug under the ground and ferreted these 2 bullets out, 1 or 2 bullets, and took the bullets and put them in their pocket, and they were never seen again. Okay? The windshield on the top of the automobile had an indentation on the top frame, and if you look at the actual photographs in that, you can see there was a pretty heavy impact from a weapon. If you know anything about weaponry, it looked like a weapon had hit it based on observation. Now let's go to the grassy knoll. And I ask you this question here, is that when something happens, there's always a reaction to what happens. And when you're watching a football game and something happens in the stands next to you or two sections away from you, and there's a fight or tussle, everybody looks to that, and some may go over to help or whatever it may be, and you head in that direction. And there was a tremendous number of people that ran towards the grassy knoll based on instant response of a person reacting to something that occurred. Okay? And then there's another photograph. The next page is also the grassy knoll to show you all of the congregation of officers and so on that were up there. Okay? The Warren, on the next slide, the Warren Commission report came through, and they said there were 3 shots fired, and that top slide shows you the drawings that were done out of the book with, I think it was Robert Grodin's book. I give him credit for that, and then there's an index at the end to show who I got these from. And then the shots that were actually fired based on testimony of all the people. Now I ask this question of you: how many people in here believe that Oswald was the lone shooter? Still one person, okay. All right, well, he was a good shooter. Okay, then let's go to the next slide. I repeat this photograph again, not for the grim picture that it is, but I show it to you for a reason. Everyone knows, and I made this statement to the agents that I was with in the book depository, that first of all, to take a scoped rifle with a bolt action to it, and how many people out here have taken a pair of binoculars and gone out to look at a plane or a bird or something and then dropped the binoculars and then gone back up to try to pick up that object again? Diminish that down to a size of maybe a quarter, which is the size of maybe the scope, and then bolt action that the first round seated. So you fire the first round, that's a given. But after you eject the first round in that, then you've got to seat the next round, and then you got to pick your target. And then you got to eject that, and then you got to do it again. And to do that, 7 seconds, 3 rounds, I said it was an impossibility. I've been through Korea, and I've been in the Army for 3.5 years, and based on my experience and weaponry and that, I just said, that can't be done and be that accurate. Maybe it's a quirk, but anyway. But then the thing that's a telltale sign is this photograph. If you take a look at this picture, if Oswald had shot from the book depository, from the loft, and the bullet had traveled and hit him in the back of the head, the trajectory of that bullet would have blown the front of his face off. The skull's not a very thick object, and it may deflect the weapon, but most generally the weapon would probably go through and crush the skull, and there would be no face left. And yet his face is totally intact, and that's why I wanted you to see that picture. They talked in terms of subjects who were people that could be involved. There were 3 bums that were picked up out of the railroad yard behind the grassy knoll. And the man in the middle is a man by the name of Charles Harrelson. His son is Woody Harrelson, who was the bartender in Cheers. And the little fellow there, the third person down, said that he gave him the gun and that Harrelson used that to shoot the president. Charles Harrelson is presently serving life in a penitentiary at in Austin, Texas, for killing Judge Wood on a drug case. They took the picture down to him and they showed him this picture, and he said, he had a grin on his face, he said, looks like me, but it's not me, and he threw the picture back, and that was the last question that was asked of him. He asked to go back to the range, and he did. Now I want to show you the next, go back on that one. Read this document carefully, what it reads here. And it says, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has requested that certain pages of this document not be disclosed. This request was incorporated in a letter of August 13, so-and-so, okay. The right-hand column reads, FBI memorandum from their files on Joseph Milteer. Although the Warren Commission had reviewed these documents during its investigation, they never acknowledged them publicly. The Commission eventually concealed them within the National Archives. So everything concerning Joseph Milteer was hidden in the National Archives, okay? I'm going to read a little bit to you, if I might. Bear with me. American Heritage Dictionary College Edition reads, murder, the unlawful killing of one human being by another with premeditated malice. Obstruction, to impede, to retard, to hinder, or interfere with. One that obstructs, an act of instance of obstructing. Aid, to give help to or assistance to. Abet, to encourage, incite, or help in wrongdoing. Once we have these definitions, then one needs to review the law to obtain the criminal meaning and charges. The president is murdered, and they forcibly take his body out of Dallas, Texas. The crime was not a federal crime. The Secret Service had no jurisdiction. The FBI had no jurisdiction. And the local authorities had the full right to investigate that as a murder. And they got into a scuffle, and they forcibly took the president's body out of Parkland Hospital and took it to the airport and put him on at Love Field and flew him back to Washington and then took him to Bethesda Naval Hospital. All of these things are acts that were committed by people, whether deliberately or accidentally or whatever it may be. That'll be a determination that we'll never be able to know the answer to. This is a photograph of Milteer that was given to me recently by Jeff Caulfield, a good friend of mine. Go ahead. This is another photograph of him. And that's him standing there in Dallas, Texas, looking at the president's car just a few seconds before he was killed. He made a telephone call at 10 o'clock that morning to a friend of his, to the informant Somerset. And in that telephone call, let me see if I can find it here. He says, I didn't really think much about the letter until the morning of the 22nd. About 10:30, I got a phone call, and I heard the operator tell me tell the man to put the money in. And then the man said, hey, well, I'm down here in Jackrabbit country. It was Joe. He was in Texas. "What are you doing down there?" I asked him. He didn't answer me directly. He just said, "Well, you won't see your friend Kennedy down there in Miami no more." And then he just hung up, didn't say another word. I didn't get to know what to make of it. And then it goes on, and there's a lot of things to discuss here. He said he was madder than hell when he found out that the Secret Service and the FBI didn't do anything with Milteer and let the president get killed, and so on. And then he says he met with Joe when he got back, Joseph Milteer, and he says he was really feeling good about it. He was laughing and slapping the steering wheel as they were riding in a car, just happy as hell. And he started telling me a little bit, not all at once, but in drips and drabs, over a long period of conversation, all the hours we were driving. He said there were shots from 3 directions. He didn't shoot at all, he said. One shot was fired from a window, but he really didn't say who did the shooting. Tippit was on the top of the building, and Ruby was supposed to be on the grassy knoll. I didn't know if it was all bullshit or not. Tippit was supposed to be a strong Klan member, which is why he was in it. And he mentioned the imperial wizard of the Klan down there, Davis, some guy named Davis. He said Milteer told him that he had to change planes 3 times to get back so he wouldn't be identified by anyone. He said he went to Dallas Thursday. He tried to phone me first, but couldn't get me. So he wrote the letter and had his wife common-law mail it Wednesday or Thursday to make it look like he was still there in Valdosta. Then, if I called, his wife was to say that he had just stepped out and that she would take the message for him. Nobody could say he wasn't there and not in Dallas. At the Indiana convention is where they did the most talking about knocking the president off. It got quite hot and angry. They were really going at it there. And there were some big shots there supposed to be from big shot political families, but I didn't know who they were. They were all in these closed committees, and nobody said too much about it then. In an odd sidelight, then Terre Haute, Indiana, Police Chief Frank Riddle said there is an extra duplicate, or they had an exact duplicate of Oswald's 6.5 Italian Mannlicher Carcona rifle, which they found in a Terre Haute motel 3 days after the assassination. It was traced to a San Antonio salesman who was a member of the Young Communist League and who was supposed to be an expert rifleman. He had checked into the hotel on November 25, made 2 calls to local gun shops, and checked out November 26, leaving the rifle behind. Riddle said the rifle was confiscated by the Secret Service and all his information was turned over to the Warren Commission. So you start seeing the development of a lot of subterfuge and a lot of things that are starting now to surface as to what really happened here and what did everyone know and what role did Joseph Milteer play in this. And the best evidence, and I told you, the best evidence that you've got is the the recorded conversation between Milteer and Somerset, where they talk about taking him out of a tall building with a high-powered rifle. That's the best evidence you can get. There's only one better, and that's if you and I talk and I know definitely what you said to me. Then that's as good as you can get. But the tape-recorded conversation planted by a police officer in Milteer's residence, in Somerset's residence, you can't do better than that. So anyway, as a result of that, you have all of this stuff that's starting to develop. And of course, I started wondering, what's happening here? And then all of a sudden, I started taking a look at documents that I was involved in. There's a photograph that was taken of Joseph Milteer. Show the next slide, please, Doug. And it says down there, photo taken 11/27/63. That's the bottom of that first paragraph, okay? And that's Atlanta FBI number file for Joseph Milteer. I didn't take that picture, and I was the one that took him into the office. And that certainly is not an FBI office. It's on some kind of a veranda. But then that bothered me, why this document had this information on it. And there's information in the files here by Royal McGraw, where he says that that photograph was taken on November the 27th, 1963 by the FBI. And this is my partner who's making this statement. So that bothered me, and again, receiving information concerning documents and stuff that came in and that. Here's a report from the Atlanta office that's going to the FBI in Washington. It's written by Royal McGraw, my partner, and it has Joseph Adams Milteer as the title of the case, and it has in there to the Bureau one photograph of the subject. That picture that I supposedly had taken was being now sent to Washington, was now being sent to Atlanta and to Washington, to Atlanta and then subsequently to Washington. And then when I read the report that's done by McGraw, in this, he says in here, American parties of the U.S. as a front to form a hardcore underground group for possible violence in combating integration. Milteer on 11/9 was in a conversation concerning the possible assassination of President Kennedy. Milteer on interview admitted being a member of the White Citizens Council. I knew nothing about no November the 9th tape recording, and yet Royal McGraw knew about it. And then as you read this investigative report, they've taken some of my investigation, which is never done in the FBI, and you take some of my investigation and you alter the documents and you include new information in those documents. And in this report that is going to Washington, which is now showing back that they were doing background investigations concerning Milteer on September 24th, 1962. Now think about that. I did my investigation in November of 1963, and McGraw was doing workup on Joseph Milteer on September 24th, 1962. And here he did this background information. The thing that really troubles me by this is the factor that it reads down here, Chief William Elliott, Quitman, Georgia Police Department on September 24th, 1962, and January 7th, 64, advised Milteer had no identification record with this department. And Bill Elliott never said a word to me about the factor that he had done a workup on Joseph Milteer, for the FBI for Royal McGraw. My partner, the man that I worked with for a year and a half. Okay? So then that troubled me, and then I started trying to think, well, you know, where are we going with this thing? I mean, they changed the height of him. They showed him at 5'4", and I stood next to the man and I took leaflets and literature from him on a Saturday afternoon, on a hot Saturday afternoon, of hate literature that he published. And he did this by the ton loads. He Xeroxed this stuff and mimeographed this stuff in his house and passed this out to everybody. He hated the Kennedys with a passion. And then all of a sudden I say to myself, you know, with all that information and all that intelligence, why would my partner not tell me what's happening here? But then all of a sudden I'm starting to paint a picture for each one of you. Start realizing the factor that maybe the government was involved in this. Who can control and do all the things that were done? People said that the Castro and the Cuban government killed Kennedy. Can they lock the files up till 2027, which they initially were done until they opened them up later? Can they change the route of the presidential motorcade on the day that it's being done? Elm Street, if you looked at the map, Elm Street goes straight on down and then turns and goes left into the Stemmons Expressway, and Main Street comes down, directly down towards the Stemmons Expressway. They parallel each other. They're 1 block apart. And yet they forced the president's car to make a turn, a 90-degree turn on Houston Street, and then a 120-degree turn on Elm Street. For what reason? And the Secret Service agent, Kellerman, who was driving the automobile, stepped on the brakes twice and turned his head around and looked at the book depository building. A reaction that a Secret Service agent is not supposed to act that way. He's supposed to act immediately and instantly and get the hell out of there if there's a shot fired. And there's a lot of questions about that, about why that was done and why that car was slowed down, almost to a complete stop, which is ridiculous for someone who you're trying to protect, if you're trying to protect the president. So then when you start taking a look at all the things that happened, the changing of documents and the information that was not furnished to me that we should have known about and would have stopped the president from going. And when you start looking at all of that information, and then you take a look at all the gunshots that occurred in Dallas, Texas, and you take a look at what the Warren Commission did, there's two things that stand out that you have to remember if you don't remember anything from my talk tonight. And one is that there was an entrance wound in his throat, which indicates a shot from the front. And the presidential limousine had a bullet hole in the windshield. And I want to just mention real quick, like in this book, Murder in Dealey Plaza by Dr. Fetzer, he says in here that that vehicle was taken from Parkland Hospital. It was immediately washed down, which is in violation of everything concerning good evidence. And they immediately washed the vehicle down and took it immediately to Love Field and put it on the plane and transported it to Love Field and flew it to Washington, and then from the air base up there, Andrews Air Force Base, they took it to the White House, kept it there, and immediately took it to Dearborn, Michigan, to the Ford Motor Company, and they did a secret removal of that windshield and put in a replacement windshield. And he says that as fact in this book, okay? Now, when you start looking and adding all these things up, what conclusion do you come to?